Hello, gentlemen. And I use the term loosely.
Hey, Mr. Marvin, how are you doing, guy?
I am doing great, John. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. Mr. Bob?
Hello, sir. How are you?
Well, if I could get my video to stay on, I'd be in good shape, but it won't.
Well, that's okay. We remember what you look like,
I see.
and it was all good. It was all good.
Okay.
John, how are you doing these days?
Doing fine. I'm
Good.
not doing anything except staying home.
Well, that's a good thing to do. That's a great thing to do. Did you do something really nice for Beth's birthday?
Yep, we did. We did.
Good.
Didn't do a whole heck of a lot, but I think the only thing we've accomplished lately is getting a couple of shots of vaccine.
Well, that's a good accomplishment.
Yep. Come on. What's wrong with this stuff? Can I start?
Bob Danielle Stevens is right over here.
I'm not dissing you today.
Hey, hello. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
You know, I'm really doing well. I'm feeling better. I'm popping and going. I still pace myself a little bit, but I'm doing really well. They tell me that I have to wait 90 days after having had COVID before I can do a vaccination. So I guess that's probably June, something like that. And by then, who knows what vaccination I should take. There seem to be so many choices out there. So we'll see.
How's
Now, I'm always
Elizabeth
people.
doing?
So the people who I've
How's
talked to
Elizabeth
have had different reactions. So John, you and Beth had your shots.
Yeah, we had our shots, no reactions whatsoever.
Okay, so you had the 2-shot thing.
Yeah, we had 2 shots of Pfizer.
Mm.
We drove out to Seymour, Texas and got shot.
Oh, yeah. See, Jessica Mattern, she went to Abilene earlier this week to get hers. And Marvin, have you gotten yours?
Not yet.
Well, you being a young and healthy guy, I probably don't
That's
need
right.
to have one yet. You're probably
Well,
not in the group.
I have heard. Yeah, apparently Cindy Bulla says Amarillo needs people to come get shots. So, maybe we'll have a road trip out there.
That's a heck of a trip though to get a shot.
It's a long way.
Yeah. At least
That's
Jessica,
all.
when she went to Abilene, had a place to stay because her parents are there.
Oh yeah.
Marvin should have got a shot with the governor while she was down there.
Oh yeah, yeah. And then they could have trade off mask.
Yeah, meeting with the Nathaniel, what do they call him? The Nathaniel or something. I'm gonna click off.
If John, if male pattern balding puts you in a high risk category, I'd be first on the list.
That's right. That's right.
Ask him for me, please.
Bob, how is Elizabeth doing?
She's not doing as well. She's still struggling a lot, day-to-day kind of situation. So it's we're really, taking it slow and easy. And the doctor said because of her underlying health situation, it's going to take her quite a time to get past it. So we're just, taking it slow and easy and hoping it all works. So we'll see how that goes. Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
Just kind of, I just want to ahead of time thank everybody for being patient as I try to work through this. Lori has several times tried to explain to me how to do all this, and I loved her optimism that I understood what she was saying. because most of it sounded like tech talk to me, but we're working on it. But we're about that point. We're going to talk about the new contract changes, working through the things, and maybe Marvin might even have an update on what the latest that zip forms and everybody thinks they may get it still maybe mid or late March, but he might have an update on that because the new contract forms are available on the Trek website. And one of the packets that we sent out to you, I guess it was probably yesterday, although it might have been some point this morning as Lori did that, has the Redline version of the new contracts of all the changes, including the 2 new addenda. And it also has the clean new version of both the contract and the 2 new addenda. And you can make copies of those and make use of them if you have a situation where you feel like your buyer needs to use the new contract form because of some of what's in the new one that's not in the old one or the current one as we work through it. But we're going to talk about that particular situation and see, because we'll want to, I have some things that we sent out just earlier today that I'll hopefully be able to figure out a way to share the screen on it and be able to make it work, where in addition, I've got an 8.5-page explanation of the changes. I've split it up into major changes and other changes, including the 2 new addenda. So you have that, but I understand no one's going to take the time to sit down and read 8.5 pages of Bob's rambling on the new contracts. And I understand that. Although when you call me with that quick question, I may ask you, I says, well, I've got that answer on page 3. Did you read that? And so I might get a little with you and do that. But so in addition to that 8.5 pages, I actually also have a situation where I've got a 1.5 pages of best practices that reference to that 8.5 pages of explanation. And I have a 1-page highlight / bullet point that really says, here are the main points of what we're talking about in the changes. And I've got that. I've also got that same kind of thing. We've had recently a lot of conversations, questions, challenges with the appraisal addendum and with the appraisal situation we're dealing with appraisers right now. In this market, I would just hate to be an appraiser. The challenges of things you're going through. And one of the things, and I'm going to ask you guys to give me some feedback here, we're experiencing many lenders with a large down payment, and some of them that's 20%, but certainly more than that are not even requiring an appraisal. And they're just, running the deal through and not even messing with an appraisal, which is creating some interesting situations. Some lenders for certain types of loans, though, to do that are requiring 50% down. And then, of course, because of what we had 2 weeks ago, many lenders are requiring re-inspections on properties that, because of what we went through. And if you've got any damages situation where you checked in with your insurance company or adjusters or your client has, then insurance companies are requiring re-inspections before they will cover. And because we're finding the range of what's going on out there, particularly in the jumbo properties and the more expensive properties, many of the some of the very high-end properties have a sprinkler system within their house. And if that house went through the situation where they lost power for several days, and what's happening is those sprinkler lines froze and they're thawing out, and you now have massive damage throughout the house because you've had those sprinkler systems now. Those lines break loose and go through it. In fact, one of our agents has a situation where she had that happen in their house. And she said with all the extensive damage throughout and in the walls and the roofs and ceilings and everything, it looks like they'll be out of their house for like 6 months. So they'll have to, be somewhere else in a short-term, whatever situation. So, when you've got things like that, where you have insurance companies involved, plumbers, contractors, all those things, it creates some really complicated situations. And we need to really be clear on what our role is as we work through that. And we just need to advise our clients, here's who you need to talk to. You need to talk to your insurance agent. You talk to an attorney, you talk, this, that, and the other. And we just have to be very careful. Even if we had a personal experience with our property or our situation, don't transfer that over to what our client situation might be, because their insurance company, their adjuster, the appraiser, everybody might do it entirely different. So be very careful. Just like we don't ever want to represent anything about the condition of the property. That's not our role on any level. That will always come back and bite us. We need for when a buyer decides they're unhappy with what the seller has disclosed and they feel like the seller failed to disclose something and misrepresented something about the property, we want to make sure that that buyer on the other side who's going to, complain and make demands or whatever against seller, that they don't include us, because they say, well, listing agent, you told us this house was perfect and great plumbing and great roof and great this. You won't ever say that, because when you do, you and us, we become personally responsible for some aspect of the condition of property, and we can't ever go down that road. So we've got to be very careful. It's one thing to, every time we say anything about a property, we always have to source that information. And the simple example I use in classes, when a buyer says, well, how old is the roof? Well, the seller may have told you the roof is 2 years old. Well, you don't say, oh, it's 2 years old, because you've made a personal representation. What you say is, well, here's what the seller says, and take that seller's disclosure notice that seller completed and hand it to the buyer and says, seller says 2 years. So it's the seller's representation. We always source any disclosure we make, any information we have. When we communicate something, we're communicating it to the other side, but it comes, directly from our client as we work through that. So we're going to deal a little bit with that. We've had an interesting situation come up with actually one agent I talked to last night and this morning, but it was another previous agent. We'll talk a little bit about the issue with competing clients, competing buyer clients. Because in this low inventory world we're in now, we may have a situation where you may have two buyers and there's a property that's just right for both of those buyers. And so we'll talk a little bit about the competing client paragraph in the buyer representation agreement that we use, and we'll kind of work through some of that. Even more so than normal, however, I want all of you to feel really comfortable making comments, asking questions as we go through this, because we really need to see what your experiences are, what's going on out there, that we can all learn from, because that's going to be the real benefit. So as we go through this, and I talk about the changes and I talk about best practice and things like that, I need for you to say, whoa, slow down, Bob. Let's talk about that one more time. And we will as we go through it. So any questions so far as we're working through this? Everybody semi kind of on board with where we are? And let's see if we can perform a technological miracle and see if there's anything that I can pull up that makes sense as we work through it. Try that one more time. Okay, that's concerned right to terminate. That's concerned right to terminate. Let's see if I can find anything dealing with changes. See if I have that somewhere. I don't see that so far. Let's go ahead. Well, I've got this, so I've got this, and then maybe Lori or whatever can help me later to get into the other thing. So this particular supplement you should have in your packet. It was sent out earlier today, and I'll go ahead and work through it and kind of roll it and deal with it. Let's see, I may have, let me see if I got the rest of that in here. Okay, so this is a combination of the explanation, the 5-page explanation for the lender appraisal. You should already have that. And I've actually, we had a previous class that we talked about this in detail. And I certainly am very receptive to us discussing it some more and answering any of your questions before I get into the supplement on this. Is everybody familiar with this track addendum that deals with a buyer having certain rights relating to the appraised value? Has everybody at least had some exposure to that and they have some sense of kind of what that is? So anyone who says, is this new, Bob? Did you just make this up, or what's going on here? Is everybody kind of semi-okay with this?
Yes.
Okay. So in the first part, it actually uses examples, dollar examples, and it includes, the 3 choices on the addendum and explains them in fairly significant detail, because it's a 5-page explanation of that. But because we continue to have other kinds of situations, I created a supplement to this, which is this right here. And this is because we kept having situations. In this multiple offer scenario, the buyer wants to do everything they can to create with competing offers and work through the process and make this an attractive offer for the seller, either to be the winner in a multiple offer situation, or maybe make such a great offer that the seller accepts it and you kind of avoid getting into a multiple offer situation. And the buyers are working through a process where they're trying to do something that the addendum itself doesn't allow. I mean, at least it doesn't provide what the buyers want to do. And I'll give you an example that one of our agents had with her buyer. And what she wanted to do was what the buyer wanted to do. The buyer made an offer, and we'll just use the numbers. The property was listed for $660, or actually $650, and the buyer was willing to pay $40,000 more than the list price, and so they were willing to go in with an offer for $690. But the buyer, for whatever reason, wasn't willing to, on the appraisal addendum, check off on the first box, which totally removes the appraisal as a contingency, because the first box is a total waiver, and so the buyer wasn't willing to do that. And the second box, where you can have the ability for a partial waiver and put a number in there, the buyer was saying, I really want this right of mine to be tied to an appraised value. Well, the problem with that is we don't know what the appraisal is going to be. And because we don't know what that's going to be, we can't even, it'd have to be a very complicated formula that we use to try to accomplish that or try to do anything. And because the buyer is wanting to, and they were saying, well, you know what, I'm willing to offer 40,000 more than the appraised value. And so in my example, where we're looking at, I think a 650 list price, and the buyer says, you know, I'll pay 40,000 more than the appraised value. Well, that potentially creates a real challenge for the seller, because he's got it listed for 650. He's probably comfortable that this 690 offer from the buyers is not going to appraise for that. But the seller says, you know, if I agree to this, to a sales price 40,000 over the appraised value, what happens if it appraises for 600,000? Does that mean I now have accepted a $640,000 deal? And seller says, you know, I'm not going to take 10,000 less than the list price. I've got all these other people who are offering more than the list price, and you know, many of them are waiving the appraisal contingency. But the buyer, our agent's buyer said, well, but I need some assurance of the value of the property. And when I decide how much I'm going to pay more than, it's going to be more than what somebody determines is the value of the property. And so as we work through it, the first thing we need to be clear, if this kind of language is created and put into the offer, as opposed to using the addendum, it has to be attorney prepared language. And the challenge is most attorneys won't even try it. They say, you know what? I don't want to get in the middle of that. There's too many risks. And what most attorneys have pointed out, if you go down this road of tying something to an appraised value to an unknown, saying, you know, I'll pay 40,000 more than 40,000 more than, the attorneys are saying, you know, you're kind of moving in the direction of what you're really doing is doing something that equates to an escalation clause, which we don't ever want to be in the middle of on any way, shape, or form at all. Too much liability for everybody involved. And so as we try to work through this and try to find a way we could deal with it, dealing with this big unknown being the appraised value, you know, the recommendation to the buyer was, okay, I tell you what, why don't we go ahead and use the appraisal addendum and use the second choice where we have a partial, and you've already, you know, you're making an offer for 690, 40,000 above list price. So why don't you put 650 in that second choice? So you're committed to 40,000 above the list price, and if it appraises for 650 or more, you're going to cover the appraisal gap. You're going to take care of that because you've already said that you'll do that. If it appraises for less than that, you can get out of the deal. You have a new point of negotiation. And seller says, well, you know, I'm not so sure I'm good with that. Well, here's what we'll do. And actually, in this case, an attorney put some language in special provisions. The buyer says, okay, I tell you what, we're going to have the appraisal done within the option period. Let's negotiate a little better option period, maybe 10 days, 12 days, something like that. And the buyer talked to their lender, says, we need to have an appraisal done within this timeline. So now we know what the appraised value is, and the buyer and seller can now agree on how much more than that. So if it's a number that's close to or the same as the list price or close enough that the parties go, you've got a new point of negotiation. If you can't come to some agreement, the buyer has that unrestricted right to terminate to move on. We kind of solve the problem of the unknown being the appraised value. We don't know what that is. Just there's so many ranges of what it could be out there, even with a good appraiser, even with a good appraisal package and everything you do, and even with your CMA saying, well, here's what it ought to be. I've got all the comps and everything. No rhyme or reason. I mean, what it might end up being. So in this situation, if we've got a buyer who just simply can't make use of the addendum, then maybe we work through a time frame where we establish the appraisal, get that appraisal done early enough in the transaction where the buyer still has rights to termination. Could be the option, could be financing, could be mandatory HOA, could be any of a number of different things. But the buyer has that ability, once they have the appraisal, to now renegotiate. So that's how we dealt with, in that case, a buyer who was really tied into the concept of, well, I'm going to tie everything to an appraised value. And that's how we try to figure out what to do it, because you just can't create a formula dealing with an unknown. I'm sure there's some, quantity of math out there or something like that, just like quantum physics, that gives some kind of formula, but we just didn't have the ability to come up with it. So that's how we dealt with that particular part. Any questions so far on that before I get into an explanation? Make sure we have a better understanding of the appraisal addendum and the concepts of what the choices really are there. Now, always have to be patient, let people unmute themselves, say, whoa, Bob, wait a minute. What are you talking about here? James?
Yeah, is it still true that's only on conventional? If it's FHA or VA, does that still have the limit?
Yep, absolutely correct. It's a good point. The appraisal addendum can only be used for conventional financing. Cannot be used for FHA or VA, and actually says that on the addendum itself. And you cannot do that because FHA, VA rules are too tight and they don't allow it. You also cannot use it for a cash transaction because there's a specific reference in the addendum to the third-party financing addendum. So if you do, so you can only do it with a conventional loan as you work through it. So to kind of follow up on that, we still need to remember this addendum is totally voluntary. You don't have to use it. You're using it because either the buyer thinks it'll help him create an edge in some way, shape, or form and give them an advantage over what another buyer does. Because I promise you, if the seller has some concern about the appraised value and they've got two offers and one of them is using the appraisal addendum, particularly if they've checked off box 1, total waiver, seller's going to like that one a lot better than the other one, presuming everything else is reasonably the same, as it were. So either the buyer is trying to create a situation where it's a more attractive offer, or we've got the seller saying to the buyer, hey, you know what? I don't want to have to worry about the appraisal. If I'm going to end up with a contract with the buyer, I want everybody to feel really good this thing's going to move forward and you'll be able to get your loan and work through that. And so sometimes that kind of pressure from the seller causes the buyer to want to use this addendum. Now, the concept of this addendum is that it's really two concepts. One, it's a waiver in some way, shape, or form of the appraised value contingency, or it's an additional right of termination, which is choice 3. But choice 1 and 2 in the addendum are both waivers at some level of that contingency of that buyer's right to terminate the contract. Now, we need to be comfortable with the concept that this only addresses appraised value, does not address any other lender requirements. Repairs, insurance, any condition issues, any title issues. It only relates to the appraised value. That's all it deals with. And so as you work through this, everybody needs to understand that's all we're talking about on this addendum. Somebody, buyer or seller, is concerned about the appraisal contingency and we want to deal with that. Now, in the case of that James brought up, FHA or VA, we've had a couple of situations where it was an FHA loan and their loan limits have gone so high now that it's more included with FHA. And what it requires is an attorney to prepare language for special provisions to create that contingency. Now, what we don't know, and we're very careful for the buyer to understand this, we don't know the degree to which even attorney prepared language is going to override the FHA rules. The FHA rule, even if a buyer in the offer says, you know what, I'm going to totally waive the contingency, and I know FHA gives me that right to, have that protection, but I don't need that protection. I'm going to close on the deal regardless. Even though the buyer says that, and it says in the contract in special provisions, it wouldn't keep the buyer maybe as he moved forward and towards closing after we get the appraisal. Buyer said, well, now that I think about it, I don't think I want to really do this deal. And they may use the FHA rules as leverage. Now, seller may end up suing them because, hey, here's what you promised and what you said in the contract. It was a minimum, you got to dispute. But if you're going to do an FHA or a VA loan and you need this appraisal protection, and that's going to take attorney prepared language. If you can find a good attorney, who'll do that. So we need to be somewhat careful with that. So the 2-page supplement here really addresses these things. It helps you understand the things that we're dealing with. That's in the 5 pages. That's in the addendum itself, because we're really having considerable number of questions. This morning on my way in to a meeting, I got a call from a broker friend of mine in a small company, and she had a conversation. She's got the seller, and she had a conversation dealing with the third-party financing addendum that really rolled around into the appraisal addendum. And this is a very sharp lady who's got a good little company and knows what she's doing. And she had to really think through the concepts of how this was good or bad for her seller, how this worked for her seller, didn't work for her seller. And in her particular situation, the buyer was putting a fairly significant amount down, almost 30% down. And, as we talked through it, I said, well, okay, so if you got the seller and you've got multiple offers, and she said they had 5 offers. And she said, the problem is these 5 offers are very, very close. They've got pretty much good terms across the board. We're not talking much of a difference in sales price kind of thing. And so we're really struggling with which one. And we seem to like the one that has the larger down payment. And that's very often what a seller will look at. We need to remember, in a multiple offer situation, the single absolute most overriding criteria above everything else is certainty of close. Which one is most likely to close? I don't care if they're offering 100,000 more than the sales price. It doesn't matter if it doesn't close. So making that determination in this particular case that she was talking about says, okay, so you've got 5 good offers. The seller kind of likes one with a large down payment. Now, what this means is you've got to talk to the buyer's lender. You've got to get a proof of funds. You've got to make sure the buyer has the money to make that kind of down payment and to cover any gap. And you've got to ask questions like, does the buyer have a house to sell? Because they don't have to tell. Buyer doesn't have to tell the seller they have a house to sell. They don't have to use that contingency. You don't have to do it. And they may use some other excuse to get out of the deal. So you always need to ask. Listing agent needs to always say, okay, you got a house to sell? You got anything else going on? Are you in contract on any other properties? We had one of our agents had a seller, and the buyer terminated the contract during the option period. The agent discovered after the fact, as they were in a conversation, almost a casual conversation with the buyer's agent. And the buyer says, I tell you what, I'm getting so frustrated with this buyer. This is the 3rd contract in a row they have terminated during the option. You know what? From the seller standpoint, we'd like to have known that before the seller accepted their offer. Because these are buyers that just can't ever finally commit. They get into a contract and they waffle and they do this and that and whatever, and then they're gone. And all they're doing is they're going out spending option fees. Those are things we'd like to know, because that's a low certainty of close when you've got buyers who are doing things like that. So the listing agent talking to the lender, finding out what's going on with the lender, finding out what's going on with this buyer, working through the process, really, really important. Any thoughts or questions or comments on any of that as we're going through it?
Bob, hey, this is Adrienne Leonard.
Yes, Adrienne, how are you today?
Good. I wanted to ask on that appraisal addendum waiver, if number 1 is marked and the house does not appraise for listing, so now
Does not appraise for what? The sales price?
the sales price.
Yeah, okay.
So now the buyer has to bring more money, cash, to the table. However, their loan is still approved because they put a large down payment down.
Yeah.
If the buyer terminates, does the seller get the earnest money?
Yeah, great question. And here's what we're talking about. When you look in that first waiver, that first paragraph there, and it talks about lender reduces the amount of the loan due to the opinion value, the cash portion of sales price is increased by the amount the loan is reduced, which means buyer has to come up with that additional amount. Now, what should happen in this situation is that the buyer should be held in default. And when you look at paragraph 15, the default paragraph, one of the choices for the seller is terminate contract and take the earnest money. Now, one of our challenges, Adrienne, is, and I almost get a call daily. Actually, not that often, but pretty close to it. Dealing with the issues of earnest value, of earnest money being released, and because the title company said we got to have everybody's signature, and buyer or seller, whoever the other side said, nope, you don't deserve it. You're not getting. I'm not doing anything. So in this case, because if the buyer checks off the first box, and then they can't close because they either can't or won't come up with additional money, that's a default. And under paragraph 15, seller should get the earnest money. Now, I will tell you, in that circumstance, the title company is going to require the buyer and the seller both to sign a release. And the buyer says, well, you know what? I didn't really understand what that first choice meant. That's not what I meant to do. We really felt like we still have protection under the appraised value and all that kind of stuff. So we don't think we're going to give up the earnest money. Then you've got a battle. Now, you need to remember also that what we're talking about here only applies to 2B of the third-party financing addendum property approval. Does not apply to 2A, the buyer approval. So if the buyer is doing something during the time frame, the number of days in 2A, they can still terminate the contract. Now, in your situation, Adrienne, you were saying the loan was approved, the lender went ahead and approved it, and unless the buyer had checked off box 3, then the buyer would likely be held in default, because the lender says, you know what? Even though it appraised for less than the sales price, it still is sufficient collateral for the loan because you're putting a large down payment. So the lender says, we're going to still make the loan. And the buyer says, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to come up with that extra money. I don't want to do this deal now. Well, buyer's in default. And then the seller has to decide what they're going to do under paragraph 15, the default paragraph of the contract. It's not an easy situation, and it happens on way too regular a basis. Adrienne, do you have a follow-up on that, perhaps?
I'm in the middle of it.
Oh, okay. So which side do you have?
I represent the seller.
So is this a case in which the buyer is not going to close because they're not going to come up with the additional money? And is that what's happening?
They're trying to negotiate again right now. However, the seller has a backup offer that is equally, if not better, than the one that we are supposed to close on March 12th. So, but I had, now that you're saying it really could be a battle with the buyer signing off that earnest money, I need to make sure that seller realizes that.
Yeah, and it can be, but here's the other thing. Because you threw in one additional element, being the backup, when the first contract terminates, and when we hit closing date and the buyer can't close, the seller would likely be able to have be in a position to terminate the contract. We would want them to seek legal advice to do this, and legal advice for the next thing I'm going to talk about. That termination of that first contract, according to the terms of the backup contract addendum, gives that seller a right to give notice to the backup buyer. First contract is terminated. You're now in the first position. Now, you still have an issue with that first contract dealing with release of the earnest money. We don't have any really good agreement, even between the attorneys, on that release of earnest money. How much does that tie up that first contract? So the seller needs to have a good real estate attorney, and it needs to be a good real estate attorney, not a good tax attorney or divorce attorney or something like that. Have a conversation about, what are my rights here? Can I terminate this contract? Can I enter into another contract? And with this backup buyer, even though we haven't resolved the release of earnest money. Now, if this second offer, if this backup offer or contract is that much better, then the seller may say, you know what? I want out of this first one. I'm going to release the earnest money to get out of it. So we're totally out of this first contract and move forward. Now, the good news for the seller in this, Adrienne, is this earnest money is not money out of the pocket of the seller. They don't have to write anybody a check. The buyer, the earnest money is actually, they wrote a check. That's money out of their pocket. So while the seller says, you know, this is just wrong, I deserve this earnest money, and I'm going to fight the battle, and I'm going to get a good attorney, and we're going to fight this battle. Or somebody say, you know what? It's not worth messing with. So I've got a backup here that's much better. I'm going to move forward on that. You know, here's your 3,000 back. Let's move on. And so, you know, the seller, based on your good advice, can sit back and say, you know what? I don't want to make another attorney rich in this deal. Let's give them their money back and let's move on. And that's probably the best option for the seller. And many good attorneys, when the sellers, you know, consults with an attorney and says, here, what should we do here? And part of it's going to be dependent on how much the earnest money is. If the earnest money is $10,000, it's a different conversation than it's $2,000. $2,000, a good attorney is going to say, you know what? You could fight this and you could go through the battle, but what's the point? Give them the $2,000. It's going to cost you more of my fees to deal with this. So give them the $2,000. It's not money out of your pocket. Just release it and let's get you in this other contract. And that's probably the advice that they're going to get, Andrea.
That's awesome advice. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the question.
Appreciate it.
So, but by the way, and I always, you're all my compadres, and you give me a little bit of leeway on doing things and whatever. And there's something that Marvin, are you still on the call? He may have stepped away from his desk for a moment because I'm going to visit with Marvin about this a little bit. I am getting so incredibly frustrated with this battle over the release of earnest money when it appears that in the contract, the parties have agreed on who gets the earnest money. I mean, you'll have language in there that says buyer's right to terminate, and if buyer terminates in this provision, they receive a refund of the earnest money. I mean, it's pretty clear language. And then the seller, because they got their nose out of joint, said, well, I don't think I'm going to do that. I don't think I'm going to sign. And then the title company, because they're trying to play a CYA, well, if everybody doesn't sign, we're not willing to take the risk and we're not going to do anything. I would like to see us somehow, and it might be a combination of Broker Committee and Texas Department of Insurance, create something in the contract that somehow addresses the risk that the title companies are concerned with, that the parties agree in the contract to not hold the title company liable if they release the earnest money according to the terms of the contract. Buyer and seller agree that their only recourse is each other. In fact, it may require a new paragraph similar to the default paragraph to address release of earnest money. Maybe part of paragraph 18, the escrow paragraph, or maybe a new paragraph 24. But I got yelled at. I mean, respectfully, but yelled at by one of our clients who said, what in the that is going on? This is what I agreed to. This is what the other party agreed to. How come I don't get the earnest money? That's what we agreed to. Look at their initial at the bottom of the page. Look at their signature here. How come that doesn't count? And I didn't have a good answer to that. I said, well, because, you know, we don't spend an enormous amount of time up front saying to our buyer, hey, you just need to understand, if this thing goes south, you might get your money back, you might not. Depends on what the title company wants to do. Saying the same thing to the seller. We don't do that a lot because we don't want to create potential challenges or issues up front when it hadn't happened yet. So maybe I can get, you know, Marvin, as he is at that upper level and knows all the important people, and maybe even with Lori Levy, the general counsel for Texas Realtors, I'd like to see us make some inroads. I just think if the parties have agreed to a way that the first money's released, I think it'll have some weight. I just think that we need to figure out a way to make that happen because I'm really getting tired. And I know agents are, I hear from it. And I know clients are getting tired of, what do you mean I can't enter into another contract because I haven't released earnest money? Because the other side, what's going on here? And it's a real problem. So and I know I'm preaching a little bit here, but I just think there ought to be some way to work that out because this is ridiculous. Work through it. Any questions on the appraisal addendum as we move forward and try to go to dealing with the contract or anything else, changing the contract? Okay, no, we're good. Okay. Now, and I'm not sure and Lori, I don't know if you're still on this or not, because I'm trying to figure out how I can share screen and access the other thing being the go back over here to share screen. Because I've got the addendum to write to. I'm trying to figure out how I can get to the other things I'm doing. I want us to talk about the changes as we work through this in the contracts and where we are right now in the marketplace and how we're doing it.
We can see your screen, Bob.
Okay. I'm trying to get to the one with the contract changes and I can't as I share a screen. But when I try to get to that, nothing, that particular thing, and I don't know how to get to where I have it on my emails or anything. Wonder if there's any chance, I don't guess we've got it in chat or anything. So, all I seem to have up here is that right to terminate. Let's see if I got. Well, I'm trying to find this. I do want to see if we've got any questions that we might have in dealing with the changes in the contract and the timelines and what can be done and what can't be done. And see, because I'm incredibly overly optimistic because we have had actually classes where we dealt with this. And so I'm optimistic that we all at some level do understand that there's some major changes that we're going through now. Is there anybody out there who says, well, I've heard something about it, but I really need something far clearer on how this is all really working? Give me a little bit of sense of kind of where we are with this. Unmute yourself and say, Bob, we understand this so well, I don't even know why we're still talking about it. Any chance that's exactly where we are with this?
Probably
Need me to
not.
move on to world
Bob, I
peace?
have a question. This is Shalina.
Yes, ma'am.
Does Trek have a plan to address brokers that are not addressing real estate agents that are not understanding these contracts? Because you and I have talked about this. I keep coming against agents who are challenging what we talked about, the return of earnest, because they don't understand. And it always ends with you having to talk to that broker, having to talk to that agent. Does Trek have any plans to address the brokers that are not doing what we're doing? Because it's becoming overwhelming having to have the same conversations over and over.
Okay, so clarify for me a little bit the issue.
So the issue on third-party financing, paragraph 2A, have been the biggest battles on the listing agent saying, no, your lender has to prove has to prove something,
sure.
has to send something. Is Trek going to do anything to make sure that brokers are having these level of conversations to make sure agents are not interpreting the contract the way that they see fit.
Yeah, it's a great question, and here's our challenge. Trek already, at some level, thinks they have, because that's in the broker responsibility. Trek already has in broker responsibility a requirement that the broker needs to educate and train their salespeople. And that's what this is. I mean, and I know, Shalina, you argue with these people that blue in the face. No, that's in paragraph 2B. In 2B, yeah, buyer's going to terminate under 2B. You have something from the lender. 2A, no. You don't have to have anything from the lender. You don't have to have anything to prove it to have that they can't obtain. All I have to do is say, no, we don't can't send the termination over, check the box, and move on. But that, that gets to the level for the broker's responsibility. And that's why I end up getting into the conversation, because the broker hasn't made sure their agent understands this. And as you know, sometimes the greater part of that problem is the agent on the other side is the broker. And in that situation, it really limits, how much I can do. I can talk to them. I can say, let's read this paragraph one more time. And I try to do it in a really kind and gentle way. And sometimes that works. Sometimes when I really bring it out to them and say, yeah, here's what this says. This is a 2B thing, not a 2A thing. Sometimes that works as we work through it, but certainly not always. But this is a big problem. And this is, by the way, a problem in our industry, educating our agents within the within our own industry, making sure our clients understand the value of who we are and what we do is huge. And the reality is, the competition we're facing in our industry with Zillow and other people like that make it easier for a buyer to say, oh, I'll push the easy button and Zillow will make the offer and everything's good. I don't need a daggum agent. If we haven't educated our clients and the industry on the value of what we do and making sure on that, it's our own fault. And Shalina, the kind of agent that you're talking about dealing with that particular situation, that's exactly the thing that creates a problem for us, that buyers don't understand it. When you got agents like that, and that's the only thing that the buyer sees is that agent went through that process, it's hard. But somehow we've got to, one agent at a time, one client at a time, go through the process and deal with that. Because this is going to continue to be a huge challenge, a huge problem. Okay, so let's see if I can share the screen with this particular thing popping up. Okay, so I've got this, and now I want to try to go back to this and see if I can share a screen and see if that won't pop up somewhere. Oh my gosh, take a picture. This actually happened. So this is the draft. This is the new changes. Man. Okay, so can everybody see that? We got that screen?
Yes, Bob.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Good job, Bob.
It's a miracle. It is a
Yeah.
miracle that I could even come close to figuring out how to do this. So, okay, so this is the what we call the Redline version of the new contracts. And in the other thing that you've got where it talks about the explanation of the changes, it's 8.5 pages, and it goes into detail on all the changes. and it deals with it. And then as I mentioned, best practices, I've got a page and a half, and then I've got a 1-page highlight. But I need for us to really make sure we're in sync on what this is. I cannot overemphasize how important over the next month and a half it's going to be for you to understand these changes. Now, that goes against human nature. And I understand that there aren't 3 of us out here who are anal about contracts and read them all the time like I do. I mean, I just do it not because I'm diligent or disciplined, or I just like it. I don't know why, but that's just.
I read them, Bob, when I get home late at night and my dog is,
when you're having trouble going to sleep, you say, I need a sleep aid here. Oh, let me pull out that contract Bob is talking about. I understand, and that's good. So, okay, but here's the thing. Normally, what we do is we really pay attention, like Shalene's bringing up earlier, paragraph in the third-party function, paragraph 2A and paragraph 2B. People don't normally, agents even don't normally pay attention to the distinctions about that until they have a situation. We had a situation, I'm not sure whether she's on this call or not, but we had a situation where we had a Texas vet deal, Texas vet land transaction, and that was a financing. And the question came up, does the VA financing exception actually in paragraph 4, the second page of third paragraph, does the Texas vet program fall under that VA? Because on the FHA VA loan, the timeline for the buyer to be able to terminate under property approval goes all the way to closing. For conventional, it has to be 3 days prior to closing. Well, in paragraph 4 on the second page, third party financing, there's a sentence in there saying the 3-day thing doesn't apply to FHA and VA. So our question was, what about Texas vet? Is that part of the VA program? What we discovered was no. But what we didn't really understand and know that till we had something happen that made us go to it and look at it. And that's the norm. We really look at what's going on in the HOA addendum in the choice that's made by a buyer of A2 rather than A1. We don't really think about that difference other than buyer pays versus seller pays until we have that happen. Now, I understand that's the norm for most people. But in this situation, I would really encourage you to see this as an opportunity to really shine, to stand out with your clients. Your conversation, your understanding of these changes can really this can be part of your listing presentation. You're not going to be braggadocious. You're not going to say, you know what, you're lucky I got here. You're lucky you're thinking about using me because I know stuff that most other people don't know. Let me tell you how lucky. You're not going to do that. But in the conversation, part of the rapport building, one of the really important things when you talk to a seller, you're going to say, there are things that are now in the contract and 2 new addenda that are going to cause us to have conversations that maybe we should have had before, but we really need to have now. We need to talk about fixtures. We need to talk about if you got any fixtures that there are leases involved. We need to talk about, is there a lease on the property? We need to discuss these kinds of things. We need to talk about smartphones. We need to talk about security systems that are not fixtures. We need to discuss those, and your conversation with them is going to be in a rapport building way. So all of a sudden, things that they say, wow, I didn't realize that I need to know all that. They now understand they're dealing with an agent who can help them work through it. Because here's the challenge, and I talk about this in the best practices here. You don't want your seller, especially a seller with a strong piece of property, maybe in a potential multiple offer situation or in a multiple offer situation, you don't want them to end up in a contract with a buyer and not have provided the buyer information on leases or fixture leases until after the contract, after execution contract, because under those provisions on those addendums, buyer has termination rights. Once they receive that information, they now have termination rights. Your seller wants to be in a contract with an informed buyer who has that information. So when they make an offer to the seller, that buyer's agent has done a good job of having a conversation with a listing agent saying, okay, let's talk about what's going on with the property. Let's talk about leases. Let's talk about fixture leases. Let's talk about smartphones. Let's talk about security. Let's talk about transferable controls. Let's talk about those things. And a good listing agent will appreciate that and understand, yeah, man, good. This is a buyer who, when they make an offer, they're going to be addressing these things and have the proper addendum included with it. They'll have the proper choices made that really help our client, our seller in this situation. And we're in a much better position to have a high probability of a contract that's going to close. So your ability to do this is going to be really valuable. If you got the buyer and your buyer's going to make an offer on the property and you already know or you discover that there are fixture leases, then your buyer needs to use the new contract form with the fixture lease addendum. And you need to understand it to the point where you can say, here's what this does for you, plus and minus, pros and cons. Here's why we're using it. And here's how this is going to work to your advantage and the seller's advantage, because now it's addressing these contracts. If you don't use the new form in that situation and anything goes south later, if a complaint hits, TREC is going to find us negligent because we didn't do the best thing for our client. We didn't represent them at the highest level. By understanding these things and helping your buyer use the right form and understand why this form should be used because of what's going on with the property, that builds credibility, that creates confidence. They feel very good about you and what you're doing, how you're going through it. And they're going to, frankly, probably end up referring other business to you because, you know, you've proven yourself as a really good agent knowing what you're doing. Any questions on that and why I'm emphasizing us understanding these changes? Because from the buyer side, knowing when to use the forms, not use form. On the listing side, you've got the seller and you receive an offer on the new form, or you receive an offer on the old form, and you can still get an offer on the old form up to April 1st. And you say, I'm not sure why they're using the old form because I have fixture leases here. In some way, shape, or form, I'm going to have to talk to our seller about those fixture leases. Well, if you were using the new contract form, that'd be a much easier and better conversation because it's in paragraph 4. It's right there. And you've got an addendum that should be going with it that's going to help the buyer and seller make some good choices as you work through it. So that's going to be something that really, really becomes important as you work through it. So questions so far before I try to go into some of the major points here that are in the contract. Does this make sense to me, or you just say, Bob, you're preaching again? You're just over and over and over again. You're ragging on us. Do you understand? This is a great opportunity because I promise you, and maybe this is the pure 80-20 rule. A whole lot of agents out there, while they'll know about this, they'll know there've been changes, they won't really understand why old versus new should be used. They really won't understand it. And if you've got the seller in a multiple offer situation, you don't want your seller to accept an offer from a buyer who's clueless about any of this that could create a problem after the fact.
Bob, what's the date again that we start using this one? I'm sorry.
Well, you can use it right now. It went into effect at TREC's meeting last month, February. So it actually is available now. It's on the TREC website. We don't have it in zip forms or any of the software yet. So it can be used right now. You have in your packet both this one that's the one that's the draft version as you work through it. You also have the new, what I call the clean form. It doesn't have draft written across it. That is the form with all the changes, including the 2 new addenda. So you've got that, and you can make copies of that, and you can make use of it. You can work through it. I mean, use the Redline to help yourself understand the changes, but you can use it now. April 1st, all these contract forms, these changes, the new ones have to be used. They become mandatory April 1st. So you have the ability right now in your, what I finally refer to as the voluntary period, where the buyer and seller can choose to use the old one or the current one or the new one. They can do either one because this isn't approved. And you see up there in blue at the top, the date says 11/10/2020. that was the day of the TREC public meeting in November of last year, where they approved these forms. And then last month, at their public meeting, which happened to be on a Friday this time because of the technology and outages and things like that, is when they approved 2 new forms, termination contract form and short sale addendum, because it had a bad reference, had to correct some things in there. So these are available right now, Shalina, to be used. And mostly you need to go ahead and make copies of clean new ones. So in case you've got a buyer and it's determined that they need to use this, you're prepared to do it. Or if you've got a seller and you receive an offer on the old one or the new one, you'll know the difference, and you've got one that you can use. So I think you're going to find, I'm comfortable that as this kind of gets out and people begin to be aware of it, so that closer we get to April 1st, you're going to see more and more people use the new one, because the training that's out there is significant. Brokers are doing the training like this. This is our 3rd class to address this. Title companies are doing training out there and dealing with it, because one of the changes in the rules of TREC, when the new requirements for renewal of your license, effective February 1st, if you're renewing your license after February 1st, within your 18 hours required for renewal, 3 hours of that needs to be contract related. And of course, dealing with these situations by a provider, a school or a title company or whoever, would begin to satisfy that 3-hour requirement. It can be 3 1-hour classes, a 3-hour class. CCAR has a 4-hour class that we use that meets that. So effective February 1st, if you're renewing your license after February 1st, 3 hours of your 18 hours has to be contract related. And a class on this would meet that requirement. Questions on that? Did you work through it?
So you're saying if I need to have a CE credit on contracts, this would count?
If this was a CE class. Now, we're not a provider. We're not a provider, so we don't have the ability to give CE. We're looking at doing that, and we may at some point do it, because the rules have changed in dealing with being a provider and how that is. The TREC changed those rules actually in 2019 and 2020. Right now, if we were to do a CE class here, we'd have to do it through a provider, either CCAR or Texas Realtors, for you to get credit for it. And we're looking at trying to do that, so that we could have a class like this. I mean, this is a 2-hour class, and if we have this as a CE, then this could be 2 hours towards your 3 hours you need for your renewal. So we're looking at trying to do that. We still have it. Yes, ma'am.
Stuart Title is doing one that I signed up for. They sent out an email, and it's going to be on March 9th, I believe it is.
Okay. How many hours?
Let me look. It's from 1 to 4:15.
Okay, so a 3-hour class. Good.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
And so we are seeing Republic Title has a number of contracts. The one you just talked about is March what?
March, they're being held on March 9th. They sent out an email to us on March the 2nd about it.
Okay, so next Tuesday. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, so I would encourage us all, as we get information on different title companies and providers out there who have classes like this, because often theirs are less expensive, that you share those with us so we can make sure people who are renewing their license and need to have those contract classes can do that. So thank you for that information. Is that Christine talking?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. So I think that's a good thing. So we're ready to kind of go through a quick bullet point on some of these things and kind of what these changes mean. Is everybody, we semi-ready for that? Yes, Bob. Come on, let's go.
Bob.
Yes, Bob.
Yes, Bob.
So the first significant change of any sort, it's not one of the major changes, it's what I call an other change, is in paragraph 2C, accessories. And remember, accessories, nothing in accessories relates to a fixture. These are all non-fixtures. These are things, if it's there, it transfers unless the seller excludes it in 2D. Here we deal with security systems that are not fixtures and don't fit the qualifications that and Texas Realtors has a 3-step thing that when you look in paragraph 2B, it talks about fixtures, talks about permanent installed and built in, and the requirements for something to be a fixture. 2C, not a fixture. And so it talks about security systems that if there's a security system there and it's not a fixture, doesn't fall under 2B, then unless the seller excludes it, it stays. It also talks about controls. We need to have conversations now about controls because these are often transferable rights,
Where's my?
software applications and things like that, that we need to make sure the seller is prepared to transfer those and buyers prepared to have that conversation about those. So this is something that you need to have a sense of and awareness of, that we've got new language in paragraph 2C that addresses those. Now, a big new paragraph, in fact, paragraph 4 is a brand new paragraph, and the old paragraph 4 was where we disclosed, if we were related to the principals or one of the principals. That's now moved to paragraph 8, broker and sales agents. But paragraph 4, here's the key: if there's not a residential lease associated with the property, if there aren't any fixture leases associated with the property, nothing in paragraph 4 applies. You can totally skip paragraph 4, which means none of the boxes get checked. So in paragraph 4, it says, except as disclosed in this contract, seller is not aware of any leases. So if there are no leases, it's a house, there are no fixture leases, so we don't even have any fixtures, we've got nothing, just, whatever. Then we don't have to worry about paragraph 4 at all. But if there are leases, either residential lease, there's a tenant in the property, and there's a lease attached to it, then that would be 4A would be checked off, and you would make use of the residential lease addendum. Or if there are fixture leases, and it gives you an example of fixture leases, solar panels, propane, water softener, security systems, and any other, because you'll see on the fixture lease itself, you'll see others blank there, so you can put other things on there. So if there are any of those in 4A, if that's checked off, then the addendum regarding residential lease is automatically attached to the property, to the contract. Now you'll check that off in paragraph 22, where we list all the addendums. So that's going to be checked off paragraph 22. But you're going to check, if you check off 4A, there's a residential lease, and that addendum is going to be used. So when the buyer makes the offer, the buyer is going to include with their offer the residential lease addendum regarding residential lease. That's going to be part of the offer. Now, understanding that as a buyer's agent, you immediately should be thinking, well, there's some choices in that addendum, and where am I getting the information? How do I know this stuff? Well, you only know this stuff if you ask the listing agent. And because you are aware now that if it's in a residential lease involved or a fixture lease involved, because you know to have a conversation with the listing agent, and a good listing agent will say, good, this is a buyer who's going to be making informed consent because they know what's going on, they know the lease here, and they make some good choices. Because when you go through the process and we look at the residential lease, the addendum for a residential lease, and you'll see there's some choices there that need to be made. This is the addendum regarding residential leases. First choice here under A, buyer says, okay, seller, you did a good job. You told me there's a lease, there's a tenant in the property. We knew there's a tenant anyway, so there's a lease. But here's the offer we're going to make. We're going to check off A, and seller, you have to terminate that lease by closing. We're not willing to buy the property and own it with that lease in place and with that tenant there. And so that's your first choice from a buyer. Buyer says, okay, I understand the lease, but I'm buying this because we're going to move in, or I'm buying this as investment and I want to put a different tenant in there. So A tells them, says, nope, we're not going to move forward on this lease as you work through that process. Now, there's a bold print notice there, and we need to make sure we understand in dealing with the residential lease and also in a fixture lease, nothing we do in this contract, including this addendum, nothing we do affects the residential lease. Nothing we do affects the tenant. That lease is between the seller and the tenant, between the owner and the tenant. So we need to understand, doesn't matter what we put here, the seller is agreeing to do certain things. Buyer says, don't want to close on it with this in here. So seller says, okay, then I've got to terminate the lease. They understand I've got to do it. But nothing that seller does here. The sale of the property by the seller does not terminate an existing lease. That lease is still valid, alive, and in place, and the tenant has rights under the terms of that lease. And the new owner cannot evict that tenant. There are some circumstances, but those are circumstances you have to talk to an attorney about. So it's really important for us to understand if the buyer is making this decision about I'll buy, we'll close, no lease can be in place, no tenant can be there, and there are choices to be made here, then that's an important choice for the buyer. But we need to understand everything we're doing here is up to obligations of the seller and rights of the buyer. So that first choice under this lease, we know there's a lease in place. Buyer says, I want it out of here. Any questions on that before we see the buyer's choices under B?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm kind of lost. I would have
Okay.
thought that paragraph
Good.
just meant,
Is this Janet?
it is, hold on.
Okay, Janet, go ahead.
Yes. Okay, so I would have thought that paragraph was like, if you went into it believing that the lease was going to be terminated by closing, and so everybody's under the understanding that at closing there won't be any lease. Not that, because we're never going to entice somebody to get out of a contract, right? Like we're not saying the buyer's not telling them you have to go cancel a lease that would still override the closing period, are they? Because that seems like enticing somebody to
Actually,
get the
they
contract.
are. Actually, they are. What the buyer is saying to the seller, because often, you're right, Janet, often we have a conversation and the seller says to the buyer, or the listing agent says to the buyer, say, yeah, the tenant's moving. They've already given notice and we expect them to be out before closing. That's a typical conversation. That's not binding on anybody. And what the buyer needs to say is, you know what? I'm glad to hear that. That's good. But seller, what you need to understand is if I check off A, you are absolutely obligated to cancel that lease. You and that tenant need to work this out. And that tenant needs to understand this lease is going to be gone by closing and that tenant has to be out.
Okay,
And that's
stop
what
for a
they've
second.
agreed
So I
to
want
with this.
clear. That's a lease that was by all expectations was contractually supposed to be over anyway. We're just making sure nobody extends it. That everybody helps the tenant get out because they were supposed to be getting out anyway.
Absolutely. Now, there's
But
another
the lease
point.
is not really supposed to be up for 2 more months.
You got a problem. The tenant has to agree with the seller. The seller says, you know what? I really need to sell this house. We're about to get foreclosed on. I need to sell it. Need to get this done. I know you're leasing up for 2 more months. I'll tell you what, if you'll go ahead and do an early release here, I'll give you, security deposit back, all those things back. Here's $1,000 to help you move.
Okay, but that's nothing new, right? Couldn't you have always done that? Like, is that anything new? You could have always gone, as a landlord, gone to your tenant and said the same thing, right? It wouldn't have to have been
Sure.
before.
Yeah, I agree. But what we didn't have was an agreement between the buyer and the seller that the buyer says to the seller, you agree that you're required to terminate that lease and get the tenant out there. You're required to do that. And you brought up a point in this, Janet, that's important. The lease may have already expired and they're now on a month to month and the tenant's still there. The buyer has to make a determination. Are we going to move forward or am I going to make sure that we require that this tenant is out of there? Because part of the language that's in here, when you see the seller shall deliver possession of the property in accordance with paragraph 10 of the contract with no tenant or other person in possession or having a right to occupy the property. The seller is agreeing they're going to get that tenant out. And if they don't, seller's in default, then the buyer has to go to paragraph 15, the default thing. That's why we've got a notice here that says, guys, you need to talk to an attorney. You need to consult an attorney because there are rights in here that the tenant has. And we need to make sure that anything we do here doesn't override those rights. So we need to make sure we're in complete agreement. The only recourse we have here, Janet, is the buyer has to get an attorney and go after the seller for default if he doesn't live up to what he's agreed to do in paragraph A. Because this is a big agreement of the buyer, of the seller in paragraph A. Does that make semi-sense?
Except for, in a way, I understand it's just in writing now, but it's not, it doesn't sound like it's new to me. Like we already had people who already had tenants who already were selling their houses, who already agreed to give possession at closing and funding.
Yeah, but they didn't do that in writing.
Well, they did in the contract where they said possession at closing and funding.
Okay, if they had the language in the contract, would need to be prepared by an attorney, and it needs to not only address the termination of a lease, also the possession issue.
Okay.
Because what we do here in writing is the buyer saying, when I close on this property, no one else has right to possession. That's a separate legal right in Texas that someone can have and cannot be overridden by the sale of their property. So it is new that we've got this clear obligation in writing that the seller agrees to. The parties have always had the ability to negotiate this and put attorney prepared language and special provisions where a seller agrees, okay, yeah, I'll do this, this, and this, as long as it's prepared. If a good attorney, a good real estate attorney has created essentially this language we see in paragraph A for the buyer and doing that, then they could have done that before. You can no longer do that because this is a promulgated form. If that's what the buyer wants to accomplish, they have to use this addendum. Because that's a requirement you'll see in paragraph 11, special provision says you can't be putting anything in this paragraph for which TREC has a promulgated addendum.
Hasn't
And
any
this is-
party not ever been required to use a promulgated form if they have attorneys who are willing to write up their own forms?
You know what? The parties in Texas can do pretty much anything they want to,
That's
Janet.
what I thought.
But here, if you've got a client who does that, one, we're never going to go against the advice of our client's counsel, but we're going to have clear written advice to our client saying, we need to make sure that as you instruct things to be done here, it's going to be things that are inserted by your attorney, instructions from your attorney, and we've advised you to operate under that legal advice. We don't want anybody coming back, our client coming back and say, well, I don't guess I really understood what I did here. Well, you had an attorney. You don't get to argue about that. And your attorney doesn't get to say, well, I didn't realize there was a promulgated addendum or I would have never done this. Well, you're an idiot too. I can't fix that. Just how that works.
Okay.
But they've always had that ability to do it. And even now, there's nothing in the contract unless something is statutory, and there are very few of those. There's nothing in the contract the parties can't change. We just need to say, okay, I don't even know what you've done to the contract, so you need to get some good legal advice because you made some changes here that impact on it in ways that I don't even understand.
Okay.
Okay?
So
Is my
Bob, this
good?
is Jana Ward.
Yes, ma'am.
So in Janet's example, possession is not the same as occupancy. And
No, it is. It is. It is. It is exactly the same. That there will be no tenant, no one in possession, or having rights to occupy the property. It is exactly the same.
okay,
And so in paragraph 10, the possession paragraph, you would check off the possession is transferred at closing and funding. That's exactly what it is. Possession and occupancy are exactly the same thing.
okay, but then if I'm buying a house with a lease that continues,
Then you're going to check off B,
you check off B. Okay,
paragraph B. In fact, that's a great segue into paragraph B. If everybody's good with paragraph A, let's look at what Jana's bringing up and see what the buyer's saying. Because you may have a buyer who says, I want this house because there's a tenant in there. And I like that. And they're paying good rent. It's a good tenant. They've been there for 20 years or whatever. And so the buyer checks off B. They say, yeah, I want this lease. I want this thing. There's an existing lease and it's going to be assigned by the seller and assumed by the buyer at closing. And that's going to be paragraph B. Because you're often going to have that. It's not, all the buyers who are buying out there with properties with tenants aren't always looking for owner occupied or to change out on it. When they do it is when you've got a tenant in there that may not be a good tenant or it's not paying their rent or it's a bad rental amount and they want to increase it. And so in that case, they may check off A. But in B, buyer says, yeah, I want to buy it and I want to do it. Now, in B, one, we know the buyer is going to buy this house with the lease in place. And there's some choices under B1, whether or not the leases have been delivered or not. If they have been delivered, B1A, and this is a little bit like in paragraph 7B dealing with sales disclosure notice. If we have it, fine. No rights of termination based on receipt of sales disclosure. But if we check off, B1B, buyer says, I don't have it. And so seller, I want you to provide it. And the seller has to provide it within 3 days after the effective date. And then there's a blank for a negotiated number of days where the buyer says, seller, you've got to get this lease to me in 3 days after the date of the contract. And then I want 5 days or 7 days or whatever time frame you negotiate to be able to review it and decide if I want to continue to move forward. And if I don't terminate, which I have rights to terminate after 7 days of receiving it, then I get my earnest money back. So your buyer gets to make a choice here. Seller, if B1B is checked off, seller has to provide within 3 days copies of the lease, and then buyer has termination rights for whatever the number of days. This is brand new, so I don't have any sense of, we've got some guidance on dealing with timelines where we see in the fixture releases where we see a 7-day time frame. I'm inclined to think that 5 or 7 days, something of that nature, is going to be the typical timeline we'll see there for the buyer to get a copy of the lease, to take a look at it, to read it, to review it, to have an attorney look at it, for the buyer to do that important thing. If they're going to move forward and stay in this thing and not terminate, then they're going to want to go out and meet the tenant and really find out, get a sense of what's going on. So I think that that'll be a negotiated number of days, and the buyer says, well, we're not here right now and we need more time, and they can work through that. But in Janet's question here, if we check off B, buyer's going to buy it. And right now, the thing is, we got to determine, has the buyer received copy of the lease or not? If they haven't, buyer has certain termination rights. And seller needs to understand that if the seller doesn't, when the seller looks at their obligations under B, and they need to understand the consequences. Just like when the seller takes too much time to get the HOA docs to a buyer, they're giving buyer rights of termination. Same thing here. If the seller doesn't deliver the residential lease within the timeline here, they're giving buyer rights of termination. So there are consequences to the seller for failing to do this, and they need to understand that. And the buyer needs to understand the rights that they're receiving as they go through this. So, there's a double-edged sword in B1B, responsibility of the seller, rights of the buyer. Everybody good with that before I get to B2? Questions? Okay, in B2, this addresses the security deposit. Really important. There's actually a Texas Realtor form in dealing with security deposit transfer, but here the seller is going to transfer a security deposit, if any, because there may not be any, but if there is, that's going to be done at closing. And then the buyer agrees that they're going to give the tenant a written statement acknowledging the buyer has now acquired the property, they're responsible for it, and they're responsible for the security deposit, and they're going to actually specify the exact amount of the security deposit. And so that's what we're doing in B2. Any questions on that? Now, you got the listing. Your seller needs to read B3 carefully. This is probably at the same level as a seller's disclosure notice. The seller needs to disclose and affirm certain things, and a buyer has a right to rely on those things from the seller and hold the seller responsible. The seller needs to understand what he's doing here. The concept is the buyer doesn't want to take over a lease where you've got a tenant in default, where you've got some prepaid rent issues. You've got somebody here is entitled to certain things. The seller really needs to review these and take a look at them and make sure they're all correct. If they're not correct, then the seller needs to explain it in the space provided below there. But the seller needs to read these and make sure that they understand what they are representing to a buyer. So you need to be comfortable with, and maybe comfort's too strong a word, but you need to at least be aware of what these are. In number 3, if you have the seller, your seller needs to understand, here's what you're agreeing to, here's what you're saying. And if you've got the buyer needs to understand, these are important points. I really want to make sure that the seller has affirmed these things. Now, question before I get to number 4 here, which addresses a little bit of the same thing. Number 4, sometimes seller says, yeah, that's all true. And then something happens and it's no longer true. It's no longer correct. Well, if any of it becomes untrue, then the seller has 7 days after discovering that it's not true. They've got 7 days, give notice to the buyer to cure the problem. So they send notice to the buyer saying, oops, oh, by the way, tenant's in default now, or by the way, this happened or that happened. So they give notice to the buyer. They've got 7 days. The seller has 7 days to cure that. And then as he goes through it now, if the seller doesn't do it in the 7 days, it goes beyond that, buyer, this is kind of interesting language. I'm sure some attorneys on the Berkeley Law came up with this. Well, actually, it was probably the brokers. Buyer may, as buyer's sole remedy, terminate the contract within 5 days after the expiration of the 7 days, and go through that process, and Earnest may refund to the buyer. In other words, the buyer can't just go to paragraph 15, the default paragraph, and sue the seller. The only thing the buyer gets to do is get their earnest money back. That's their only remedy, as they go through that. Now, if the buyer doesn't do anything in these timelines, they've given up their right to terminate under this provision. Now, there's this interesting last sentence. We don't know for sure exactly how this is going to end up working. There's going to be some interesting learning experiences here. The closing date will be extended daily as necessary to afford the parties their rights and time to provide notices under this paragraph. So if the seller discovers, 3 days prior to closing, something's untrue, it appears from this language that the seller now has the ability to extend the closing date to give them that 7-day time frame to cure it. And when they give notice to the buyer, it would appear that this end of the 7-day time frame, if the buyer needs to, they can they can extend the closing date to give them their 5 days to decide whether to terminate or not. That's the basic intent of this. We'll see how this ends up working out, because this is all brand new language and brand new stuff we're going here. Okay, so that's the addendum dealing with a residential lease. Any questions or anything on that? We good so far? Before we go to B, when you look at back in the contract itself in paragraph 4, if you check off 4B, that means that there is a fixture lease associated with the property some way, shape, or form. And so just like with the residential lease, there's a fixture lease. If that paragraph is checked, then the addendum concerning right to terminate is part of the contract. The buyer, when they send an offer, will include this with their offer. They'll check off the box in paragraph 22 saying that this addendum is part of it. So if there are lease fixtures, one, we're clear the buyer needs information from the listing agent / from the seller about fixture leases. And one of the things your seller has to do, they can't just assume, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we'll find transfer it. They need to know that they can transfer it, they can assign it, what the cost is, what the process is. This is particularly a challenge with some solar panel leases. Some of them are horrific. Some of them don't even allow an assignment. So the seller needs to really, and we cannot read their lease and interpret it and be practicing law. We need to say to our seller, say, you know what? You need to have an attorney look at your lease. You have an attorney advise you. Here's what you can do about assigning this lease. Here's the process. Here's what it's going to cost. And here's what the process the buyer has to go through to be able to assume the lease. So if you've got any fixture leases, and it gives you some examples, that we have here. I think the solar panels and the security systems, except for properties out in the country, are probably going to be the most common. I'm not entirely sure what other would be. I'm trying to come up with what other kinds of fixture leases we might have. Somebody has an idea or something experience, I'm happy to know that. But right now, I can't come up with another. So if there's a fixture lease, and if the seller says, yeah, there's a security system fixture lease, and they check off that box, then we have choices in A1. The buyer can choose to assume some, all, or none of the fixture leases. So in A1, the buyer's making a choice, and they're saying, you know what? They've got a security system, they've got a solar panel, they've got a water softener. I'll assume the security system and a water softener, I don't want anything to do with the solar panel. So he would create that exception in there. Say, nope, not going to do that. And then the buyer hopefully will have information from the seller about here's what it costs for me to assign this. And the buyer says, okay, I'll pay the first $100 or $200 or whatever it might be, whatever you negotiate, and seller, everything else is yours. So they make some choices there in one because seller says, yeah, we're going to assign it and go through the process. Now, questions so far on A1 before we get to 2. Now, in 2, you got a choice. Seems really simple on the surface. Seller will or will not remove the lease fixtures covered by fixture leases that the buyer does not assume. So in my example, buyer said, yeah, I'll assume the security system, I'll assume the water softener. I'm not going to assume solar panels. So we have a choice here. Seller will or will not remove the lease fixtures. And then if we check off the box, will remove, then seller agrees to repair the damages caused. Now, what the seller absolutely has to do, because the last sentence in A2 says, any lease fixture remaining in the property are subject to the rights of the lessor under the fixture lease. So the company that's leasing that solar panel to the owner, to the previous owner, to the seller, has rights here, and they have rights, and those rights may be they get to go out and just tear out the solar panels and heck with problems or whatever. It's not their problem, because remember, they're not a part of the contract. They just have this lease between themselves and the owner of the property. What I'm convinced a buyer needs to do, in addition to the seller just looking at repairing any damage, I think a buyer needs to look at what is the fixture that's going to be removed. How extensive of a damage issue might we have? And the buyer may want to create language and special provisions of the offer saying, that here's how this is how the buyer wants it to be done. This is who they want to do it. Because you may have something that you may have a whole wall that's going to need to be repainted or redone because of something taken out of one part of it. The buyer needs to look at what's going to be removed, what kind of damage might we have, and do I need to address it, or do I just need to trust the seller to make things right? I don't ever think that's a good idea. I don't want to be cynical about that, but we've had too many issues where what the buyer thought was going to be done wasn't what the seller thought had to be done. So I think some additional language would be prudent if in A2, the seller will remove the lease fixtures. When they're going to remove them, buyer needs to say, okay, you're responsible for damage. Let's make sure we're all clear on what that means. Questions on B2 before I go to 3? To go to B. We good? That? Okay. Delivery of fixture leases. Either the buyer has received them or they have not received them. Just like we talked about the residential lease. If they have received them, no more termination rights. If they have not received them, buyer has termination rights based on the receipts. Once they receive them, and seller has to get them to them 5 days after the effective date. Once the buyer has received them, they've got 7 days to choose whether or not they're going to terminate. If they do terminate, they get their money back. So I think that's an important choice that we're making here. So the seller would really want to do everything they can before buyer and seller into a contract, before we get too far down the road, to make sure a buyer has this information. So we're just not giving away easy and free rights of termination. Do we see what we're doing in paragraph B? And then C establishes, and this is a little bit of a reaffirmation of what's in paragraph 9 before, that deals with, can't be anything, no liens, nothing that's not satisfied out of the sales proceed. That's got to all be taken care of. It's got to all be done. We do make sure that we advise the seller and buyer. So you consult with the lessor, talk with their attorneys regarding any of this. I've kind of talked about that. This can be a huge challenge. We need to make sure everybody understands their legal rights going through it. Any questions on this? Before we get back into the contract and look at paragraph 5.
Bob, I
See
have a
what-
question.
Yes, ma'am. Question.
It's Christina again.
Yes, ma'am.
On the earnest money shall be refunded again. Is this still going to be an issue, or since it is?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an issue. I think everything we've seen in here that talks about buyer terminates, buyer gets earnest money. If there's people on the other side, if the seller says, you know what, I don't understand this. We did everything we were supposed to do and they still want the earnest money. They just terminate it because they don't like the house anymore. We're not signing nothing. I think you're going to still have that same problem. It's going to be interesting to see how the title companies address this and whether or not they say, that's pretty clear. Buyer didn't get it. Buyer have 7 days to terminate. They terminated. Yeah, they get their money. It's going to be really interesting to see how the title companies go down the road of continuing to require everybody to sign off. I don't know. It's going to be interesting, but until we get some really good sense of how that's going to work, I think we're going to have the challenge that title companies go automatically say everybody needs to sign. I think we're going to still deal with that. Okay, back up into the contract, in paragraph 2 of the contract, paragraph 5. I just want to touch on the main point here. I think everybody by now has heard it several times. We understand if you're using this contract form, and only if you're using this contract form, the option fee will now be made payable to the title company, i.e. the escrow agent, not to the seller. If the buyer still wants the option fee to be paid to the seller, or if the seller says, I want the option fee, they need to be using the old contract form. Because if they're using the new contract form, it's no longer paid to the seller, it's paid to the escrow agent. And that's what it says. Now, what we have to be careful of and understand, it has provisions that can be one payment or it can be 2 separate payments. One payment for the earnest money and a different payment for the option fee, or it can be one payment. I mean, it could be, you may have the $2,000 earnest money and a $250 option fee. You may make one check out for $2,250 that includes both of them. So it allows you to do that. Now, our challenge is, because of language that's further in this particular paragraph, is that the money, if it's made in a single payment, it's going to be applied first. And you see this in number A3, it's going to be applied first to the option, then to the earnest money. So if for some reason we made one check and $2,250, made one check for $2,000, then the $250 option fee is going to come out of that $2,000, which means the buyer hasn't paid the earnest money agreed to, which gives the seller some termination rights. So we need to be clear that if we've got one payment for both earnest money and option fee, it's incredibly important that we pay attention to the numbers. We don't just rely on the title company making sure the numbers are correct. So we don't give sellers rights of termination based on we've got the wrong number in there as you work through it. So you need to be really careful with that. Now, from a buyer and seller standpoint, I don't think the buyer is going to care who the check's made out to. $250 option fee, made the seller and made the title, I don't care. In fact, the buyer probably says, I like that it's to the title company because it's going to make it easier at closing to make sure that gets credited to the sales price, which, by the way, is an automatic occurrence in the new language. It's not a 2 boxes you check off on. It's automatic. Option fee will be credited sales price unless people change the language. Automatic. So buyer says, yeah, I like it to already be in the title company, so that's going to make it easier and cleaner at closing that I'm going to have that credit sales price. So buyer probably doesn't care and may actually like this. Seller may care. Seller may say, you know what? I kind of would like to have that $250, and so I can go to lunch. I'd like to get the check. Well, this particular language does not allow the buyer to pay the seller that money. It has to go to the escrow agent, and the policy of the title companies is going to vary. Most title companies say, you know, we're holding on to the option fee until closing, and at closing it'll get credit sales price. We only are going to give this to the seller if the seller requests the money, if they request the option fee. The title company says, and if they request it, then we're going to have to make sure we have good funds, which means the buyer's check for option fee and our earnest money has to clear the bank. Because the buyer, the title company says, we're not going to pay them $250 until we've made sure that's good money. Now, how the title company gets that money to the seller is going to be an issue. Because what title companies typically do when they send money to somebody else is they wire the funds. Well, wiring funds to the seller for $250, while it won't cost the title company any money because they've got huge money in the bank and banks don't charge them wiring fees, it could be a problem for the seller. Seller's bank may say, well, we just received these funds, $250. By the way, our fee is $20. So what do you mean? Well, you're only going to get $230 because we have a wiring fund charge. And now seller says, the buyer says, you know what? I didn't get the whole $250. I don't think you've got an option. Well, now you got an argument dispute. So how they get it to them is going to be a little bit of a challenge. We see to coordinate that. We're not even sure what the different title companies are going to do. We're still working through that. But that's the big change that we've got in paragraph 5. Questions on this? Remember, if you're using the new contract, it has to go to what we're already receiving. We're hearing from title companies that agents using the old contract form are taking option fees to the title companies. Title companies say, no. Old contract still goes to the seller, doesn't go to the title company. New contract form goes to the title company, not the seller. Everybody good with that? Comfortable with that? Is comfort too strong a word? Okay. You know, in paragraph 8, where we deal with brokerage fees, all those things, then no challenge, you know, nothing big there as you work through it. Just moved it to a new location, same language is still there. You still have the disclosure in there, just like you had before. Parent, child, beneficiary, if you are a principal, we still have to disclose that and work through that. The next other changes as you work through this, something that we're going to find ourselves dealing with more and more and more, and it's really good that we have it in the contract now, and it's dealing with smart devices. It explains what we mean by smart devices. I find it interesting that right now they're kind of defining a smart device as something that connects to the internet. With technology moving as quickly as it is, I'm not sure there are smart devices that don't use the internet, but I'm not high tech enough to really understand that. But so they explain, here's what it means. And it deals with things that manage your property. It deals with, you know, anything we deal with non-realty items, controls, fixture leases, all those kinds of things. And there's some requirements here that the seller has to, under C1, deliver the written information containing all access codes, usernames, passwords, applications. The buyer will be able to need to access, operate, manage, and control smart devices. And then the seller has to terminate and remove all access. We can't just presume this is automatically going to happen. We, as the agents, have to make sure they have conversations with the clients that this really does take place and it really is done. We just can't presume it because it's going to be real important. We've already had cases even before this where buyers discovered that a seller still had access to the property through their smart devices, through their computers, and did crazy things like change thermostats, change the controls over thermostat because they still had control over it. Maybe they didn't intentionally think they were doing it to their old house. Maybe they thought they were doing the new house, but it was still there. So we just wanted to go through the process. So smart devices, listing side, it's really good to have that conversation with seller. You can have that conversation now because it's in the contract. You say to the seller, hey, here's something we need to talk about. We need to work on this, go through this. Because if you get an offer, that buyer's going to expect certain things. It's going to be there. We need to be able to deal with it. So the fact that we've got it in there is really, really helps us. Frankly, it makes it easier for us to have those really good conversations. Any question on any of that? We good? The paragraph 18 is just clarifying language. Title company has had before the right to take money out of the earnest money that's going to go to a party, buyer or seller. To the title company has a right to deduct any expenses that they've incurred on behalf of that party receiving it. They're clarifying that. They're doing some definitions, clarifying what authorized expenses are, but no big real change or otherwise. It's just some language clarification. And then a little bit of language things in paragraph 21, which we're all pretty comfortable with. And we had the 2 new addenda for paragraph 22, and that's a good thing as you work through it. Did a little bit of a thing in broker information where they added a team name. So because you got so many teams so prevalent that we have that information. And we have some language at the bottom, that establishes there are separate agreements where, such as MLS, compensation from other agreements and that there. But this is just information and does not, prevail over other agreements between the broker. So if an MLS, the listing broker says 3% and the buyer's agent puts 2.5 here, doesn't apply, not enforceable. So that's just, some good language we have there. So those are the big changes. Any questions on that? So right now, these are available. One, we sent them out to you. You've got the new form in the package stuff we sent out, so you can make copies of it and make use of it. You just need to understand how important this is to your client, seller or buyer, so they understand their options, and know which way they're going to go. You don't want to have a seller when you get an offer and maybe you have 5 offers and 2 of them are on the new form and you're unable to explain those new forms to your seller. So they end up not accepting those offers, which might be the better offer. Not a good situation. You need to make sure you understand how this impacts on your client, seller or buyer, to know which form you use, because up until April 1st, parties can choose whichever one they want to use. We good? Before I go into my next subject. You guys are doing patient, being good so far. So I want to touch on a couple of things that have happened. One, competing buyers or competing clients. In your Texas Realtor buyer representation agreement, and it's actually in paragraph 8, it says competing clients. And it gives the broker the ability to represent 2 buyer clients on the same property. Very important to understand. This is at the broker level. What you have to be prepared to address, you're the agent. You have 2 buyer clients, and both of those buyer clients are interested in the same property. Because in fact, when you were looking for properties, you say, wow, that's a great property for buyer client A. And you say, wow, it's also a great property for buyer client B. So at that point in time, you realize you've got 2 competing clients. Now, you have some responsibilities to each buyer client. You're not going to give names. You're not going to say, to the Jollies, oh, by the way, you just need to know that, over here that the Walls, they also want, it's the same property. You're not going to use names, but you're going to let them know, you're going to let each buyer know, I have another buyer interested in the same property. Now, you're going to go ahead and show both buyers property. Most of the time, what happens is both buyers don't choose to make an offer. However, if both buyer clients choose to make an offer, you have to be prepared to deal with it. You will not move forward and represent both buyers on the same property. Unless you talk to me or Mike or leadership and management and talk to them, because if it's two owner occupant buyers and you're representing both of them, one of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. And the one that lost is going to be furious with you. You're going to say, you know what? You knew this was our dream house. This was our house that made everything right. I mean, our kids, their best friends live in the neighborhood. I mean, this is perfect. And you knew what it would take for us to get this house and you didn't help us. You're in trouble. Now, if you've got two investors, we may be able to do that because it's just a numbers game for them. We may move forward with two investors, but two owner occupants, no. And what you're going to have to do is figure out who you're going to keep and who you're going to pass off. Well, you're going to need to have the conversation with both of them. And sometimes they'll solve the problem. They say, you know what, we understand the conflict. And what are our choices? You say, well, you can work with another agent in our office. We can release you to another agent, another company. Whatever you'd like to do, your interest comes first. And what you may have is buyer A, maybe a buyer you just picked up off a cold call, or they showed up at an open house. There's no relationship. You've only been working with them for a week or 2 days or whatever. Buyer B may be someone you've got a long-term relationship with, represent them on many, their family and all. So it may be that the longest, strongest relationship may be the one that you'll keep. There's no automatic way to fix the problem that somebody may be unhappy with you. But on two owner occupants, you cannot move forward representing both buyer clients. They need to know that this agreement in the buyer rep agreement is at the broker level, not the agent level. And so you need to be prepared to address that and deal with that as soon as you know there potentially is a real conflict between two competing clients. They both want to make an offer on the same property. Are we good with that? Makes sense. As we have more low inventory and what's going on out there, we already have seen this at least twice, once just yesterday, and once about 3 weeks ago. Any questions on this, on the buyer rep situation, competing buyers?
I have
Yes.
a question, Bob.
Yes.
If that occurs and another agent takes over for the transaction and one or neither get the house, does the agent that represented your client end up continuing on with that client, or does the
Okay,
client?
good question. And this is part of that same thing that we've talked about before, where you're going to negotiate a flat fee arrangement with an agent in your office, take over a buyer because maybe they showed up at an open house, whatever. Your agreement with them is you're going to represent this buyer on this property. If this doesn't work out, we get the buyer back. So you're gonna automatically work it out. Now here's the risk. It may be that the agent that you refer them to in our office, that they hit it off so great, such great rapport, that the buyer say, you know what, Christine, we like you, but we really love Joe over here, and we're gonna work with Joe. You know what? What you'll do then is negotiate a referral fee. Hey, Joe, you get these buyers and I get a referral fee. In fact, that'll be part of the agreement that when you send these buyers, Joe, here, if this doesn't work out, I get them back. So if they decide to use you instead of me, I want a referral fee. So you're going to work that out. You're going to get that
Makes
done.
sense. That
Yep.
makes sense. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yes, ma'am. Everybody good with this? We see where we are with all this. Any questions? This is a lot of stuff. Is everybody clear on the timelines of where we're going with all this? What our timing is, best practices, what we're going to be doing, making use of your knowledge of the addendum, your knowledge of that. The same thing with the lender appraisal and all. I'd encourage you to read the handout you've got there from us on best practices and the highlight of that, and then the supplement that I did to the 5-page on the appraisal addendum. Any other questions there? Because we've just about
Hi,
wrapped
Bob.
it up. Yes, ma'am.
Bob? Hey, quick question. This is kind of happened to me a lot lately when I'm with buyers, random
Is this
people.
Jeannie, the
Yes,
Jeannie Gary?
hello, how are
Miss
you?
Jeannie.
Good talking to you.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of buyers very unsuccessful getting anyone under contract. And, you know, it's like a free for all at these showings and people just wander in and out. And I've had random people come up to me, ask me to take them in the house. And I said no. And the other day I literally went in the house. I was the only one, and I locked the door and they were looking through the windows and stuff till my people came. What liability is there to letting in a stranger? Because it seems like they just wander in. There's a bunch of people wandering, you know, like an open house.
Yep.
And I told them, I said, have your realtor take care of you. And they said, well, we don't like her. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry. Call the listing
That's
agent.
kind of your problem. Yeah.
So,
And so it's a great question. And aside from the doing the business side of it, if you got an agent, you don't have, the bigger issue is the safety. I cringe every time you guys, you ladies, have an open house sitting out there on the border of you know, some little town somewhere, and it's you kind of sitting out in the country all by yourself. Scares the heck out of me. And you know, every time my daughter does that, I go, man, it's just, so one, it's a safety issue and you need to control that to the degree you can. I would encourage you never to be alone. And I know that's sometimes impossible, depending on where the property is and those things, but Jeannie, you ought to have an open house, and if at all possible, Jack ought to be there. You know, he's going to intimidate anybody who wants to come in and cause a problem.
right.
But something like that. So one, safety. The other is, we can't do anything about all the crazy people out there, but you've got to be firm. So you know what? We represent the seller, and protection of the seller, their property and their persons is utmost here. And under the instruction of our seller, here are the condition under which you could see this house. And you don't get to just wander in. Because here's what I want you to think. When somebody tells you something, I don't care what it is, what you need to hear is, excuse me, ma'am, excuse me, lovely lady, would it be okay if I went ahead and came into the house? Don't worry that I just locked the door and I'm going to mug you. Is that okay for me to do that? I don't care what they say, that may be what they're thinking. You know, you just need to think about that. You just need to realize that the danger is real. We've been so fortunate in our business that we haven't had more, and we have had, everybody's aware, there've been a number of situations. So you've got to be safe. And I agree, go and lock the door. And, you know, when they start wandering around the property, I am not opposed to you calling police, calling security.
Wondering about that because they were literally looking in the
Because if
windows.
you've got somebody who is trespassing, intruding on a property, and I think, you know what, that could be, and especially depending on who they are. Now, here's the risk. If you're going to do that, you got to do it with everybody who's intruding, not just people of a certain nationality, not just people of a certain race or a certain whatever, because then you're discriminating. So you need to be pretty fair and square about all of that.
Right.
But that's a great question and something that I would really encourage all of you to be more and more careful as you work through it. Because I'm just.
A second part, I'm sorry to keep you, a second part to my question, when I get my next listing, because it's so crazy, I don't want stuff like that to play out. Can I control the listings and not do it through showing time? Or can I control?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
You're not required to go through showing time. We're going to start seeing this, by the way.
That's what I'm
going to start seeing agents put it in MLS, and showing instructions are must call agent for all showings. You're not even going to have it in showing time. Now, you'd have to have that conversation with your seller and say, here's what you need to know, but you've got a strong piece of property and we put it coming soon. We've done all the things to market it. Not being in showing time is not going to be a problem for us getting this property sold, and we won't control it.
Okay.
Absolutely, you get to do that. Now, you'll have instructed your sellers to do it. You're not obligated to go through showing time.
Okay, and then I can also like do an open house between a period of time, and that's it if my seller agrees. Okay.
Absolutely.
Because I think I just can't take it. I think it's out of control.
Oh, I agree. I agree. And I think that, you know, going through that process, dealing as long as we follow all the MLS rules as we work through it. I think with some of the things that are going on with Zillow and showing time, I think we're going to see more big time active brokers start controlling the showings. They're saying, you know what, you want to show my listing? you got to talk to me.
Okay, good. I just wanted
You're
to be
very
sure.
welcome.
Thank you so much.
Guys, thank everybody very, very much for doing this or being here. Please continue to be safe, working through it. Thank you for being part of our Market Center. We've got some exciting things coming up, including a bowl that's I think going to be coming up later this month that you'll hear more information on. And I'm proud to be in business with you. And please let us know if we can do anything to help you. Slowly but surely, we're getting more people back into the office to get that synergy going, staying safe. By the way, the governor did some state mandate changes, and that's okay. He gets to do that. Ours are the same. We're still going to, mask, still make sure that you keep social distancing. None of that's changing for us. So we're still staying safe, working through it. So if there are no last second questions, thank you very, very much.
Thank
We
you,
appreciate
Bob.
it. And I'm going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you. Take care. However I do that. In. Okay, I click in. Okay, good. Done.